California, and she's been based in Europe for about the last 30 years. And she's advised over 200 businesses in 26 countries. So I'm absolutely delighted to have you here today, Alison. We've managed to grab some of that precious time of yours and to hear about how we can keep the US and the UK business relationships going, and in particular in these unprecedented times during COVID-19 situation. So over to you, Alison.
Great, Mandy. Thank you very much indeed. So it's a pleasure having all of you dialed in today from around the globe, which is a testament to the reach of the Greater Birmingham Chamber and its influence. So thank you all for being here. So yes, we've got about 45 minutes or so together, and I'm going to aim to conclude my remarks 25 or 30 minutes in, because I think the question and answer part is probably going to be the most interesting. It usually is. So I hope you have lots of good questions, and don't hesitate to post them in the chat box as we go, so that I can have those to help answer in a few minutes' time. But first, I thought I would show you this cartoon, which probably typifies your experience of trying to retain your transatlantic customers and clients. You know, they join webinars or conference calls at various points, and they get to hear only part of the message, and sometimes the tech lets them down, and the audio fades out, and all sorts of other things happen. So I can totally relate, because I too have been experiencing that since the COVID-19 working from home scenario over the last almost 3 months now. So anyway, I just thought I would let you know I share your pain. So you already heard plenty about what I get up to from Mandy's very kind introduction. In essence, what's really exciting is being able to help companies of all sizes and industries navigate the transatlantic landscape. And you know, some people think there isn't much of a difference between the two parts of the world, but actually, you know very well, or you wouldn't be on this webinar today, that the differences are quite profound. So I spend really a lot of my time trying to help companies and executives navigate successfully so that they ultimately make money and they have happy, productive relationships. So the key things we're going to look at over the course of the next few minutes are, firstly, what drives consumers and clients in America and in the UK in terms of the business cultures. What are the motivations, or what are the ways people like to work? And then we're going to cover in a little more detail some of the brands, time permitting, that are actually being successful during this COVID-19 era in being able to engender loyalty that will last them long after COVID-19 is behind us. And then finally, to take a few minutes to suggest some ways that you can influence, communicate, and negotiate with your counterparts on the other side of the Atlantic. And I'll give you some cross-cultural academic information that will help you have that vocabulary to describe the different business cultures. So that's the plan for the next short while. I thought I'd first show you this picture of a VUCA world. So you may have heard this terminology. It comes from the American military as a way of describing what they call ground truth. So volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I'm sure COVID-19 has made your world look increasingly and feel increasingly like this swirling vortex where you're wondering, what do we do now? You know, business may have evaporated from the middle of March, as it has for many here in the UK. And I'm sure that you're just as concerned about how you navigate through this vortex and come out the other side of it intact, and preferably commercially, you know, able to rebuild your enterprise. So let's, though, get into, therefore, the first part of this, how to navigate this vortex. So what you'll notice, oops, let's go quickly, here we go. What you'll notice here is a list of some of the things that drives American consumers and clients, so that you're aware of how to play the relationship to their advantage and your advantage, and doing things with the way that you do outreach, the way you do your marketing, the way you build loyalty, the way you do your communication and keeping in touch with your customers and clients. That's going to be in sync really with the American business culture. So some of the things here are about, for example, we are pretty much low context. We want the foreground. We want the story, the immediate story, the front of the picture, not necessarily also the full back of the picture as well. We're also, what you see is what you get communicators. So American English is pretty low context itself too, and therefore just beware that there aren't hidden meanings in what Americans generally say. So being, talking through implication won't really cut through or be heard in full. We love the use of humor as a bonding tool, and while we may not get irony to the same extent, we certainly do love British humor. The wordsmithery is fantastic. So, that's another way of getting to and influencing your American counterparts. Another is this important point about anchoring us in the future. We're very future oriented as a business culture. So the more you can let us know that your product or service, because of COVID or after COVID, will help our enterprise be even more successful or happy, or as consumers the same, then we absolutely love that story. That really resonates for us. We want to be entertained in the course of your engagement with us. We want to learn something new. We want to have a little fact that you may have told us about that nobody else would know. So that's another way of keeping us engaged. Amongst others is this acronym Reiter. So it's based on some market research done by the University of Texas a couple of decades ago, but it's still just as valid as when it was conducted. And in effect, what they try to do in this research is uncover the criteria for assessing a service. So how do we score a service? And around the globe, it appears that these 5 factors are the only ones that really count, which is important because from your perspective, you now know where to put your money. But the ones in bold are the ones that in the United States really count. So it's about your responsiveness, and it's about the reliability of your product or service. So that's yet another way to keep in mind what will engage and drive your transatlantic or your US counterparts. Closing the sale. So we're a low context, explicit culture, as I've already mentioned. So there's no harm at all in saying that you want the business. What do you need to do to win it? And we expect that explicit nature of any possible transaction or business relationship, because of course in the US, business relationships are based on ongoing transactions rather than knowing all of the parties well to any particular deal or business relationship. So it's really about doing deals, and that defines the business relationship in the US. On top of that, replying to calls and emails quickly, so that's back to that responsiveness point. You've kind of got 2 days at the most to get back to an American, even if you don't have the answer to their question, whether it's a consumer or a client or B2B customer. They just want to know that their email made it through the filters. It landed in your inbox and you've got it. So hearing something, a form of acknowledgement within a couple of days is really important for us. Tell us your plan. So that highlights the T, the tangibles in that Reiter acronym. Tell us what your longer term objectives are, especially in a B2B context, because we sort of like to know that you are crafting your and sort of managing your destiny. And we love to hear the story of how you're planning to get from point A now, pre-COVID, or perhaps pre-COVID, or in COVID, to the world after that, and how you plan to recover lost business and what role they can play in helping you do that. References. So it's really important for Americans to know that your product or service has a track record with other American brands or names that they would know. And the reason that counts is because there are several companies that you may well have had great success with that aren't of US origin, but they may not be well known by your American counterpart. And if that's the case, then you're leaving to chance what your American colleague or counterpart fills in terms of the blank. So if you say one of our biggest successes is with Marks and Spencer, the Americans might say, who's that? Is that good? Is that not good? So using US examples or proxies would be helpful. So if you don't have a track record with American names, that's okay, but do a translation. So you might say, well, Marks and Spencer's one of our biggest clients or customers. That's kind of like Target in the US. And then they know what you're talking about. And then last on this slide is spinning. Breaking good news publicly, celebration, the humble brag, as it might be called, this in the European side of the Atlantic. But we certainly do like to hear that you've won awards and that you've just, had a massive order that's put you back in the black after this COVID disaster. So now let's talk about what drives the UK consumers or your clients. So there's the counterpart of this. So we like high context communications on this side of the pond. What does that mean? It means we want the backstory and the front story, because the backstory informs the foreground. So tell us the bigger picture, the integrated ways that the different players and linkages work in the machine. What you say implies what you get. So British English is much more indirect. It's implied communication. So often the conclusion isn't said out loud, and therefore beware that this is how it works here. So for you in the US, you may need to just listen differently for the unspoken part of the message, because that's just as important as the spoken part. Humor, similarly, is a bonding tool. Great idea to use it. Don't be reticent about that. And then anchor us in the past to inform the present. So in the UK, the history, how your company got to this point, it informs why you are where you are today. So don't play down the history of your American company or track record. And it's very important stuff, and it helps make sense and adds context to that story and why your story works. Similarly, the reassurance is really important. So British consumers and clients will want to know that your promise matches reality. So looking for that congruency is extremely important in the UK. On the Reiter scales, the assurance, tangibles, and empathy are the key ones to bear in mind. And then close the sale indirectly. So the assumption is that you wouldn't be having the conversation unless you wanted the business. So it doesn't need to necessarily be said out loud. That's back to the implied communication. It's okay to ask, what do we need to do to win your business as an American? But the British will know that that's why you're in front of them, or why you're on the phone, or why you sent the email. Similarly, replying to calls and emails. when you have the answers. Here you have a 2-week maximum. You know, the way it generally works is if as an American customer or client, you'll ask a question of the British company, and the British company may take a couple of weeks to come back to you because they're not going to answer until they have an answer. So don't be surprised if that's what you experience. Tell us this, what informs the plan, what underpins your plan, the backstory that informs it, the analyses, the trends. We like that context. So that'll be helpful to share that level of detail, which you may not do with your American counterpart. Global references. So the UK, being a very sophisticated global marketplace also, really likes to know that there are some global companies, international companies, where you have a great track record, and that builds your credibility significantly. And spin, but spin modestly. What does that mean? Well, you may want to not appear too overconfident, because that might look arrogant to your customers and clients in the UK. By all means, share the good news, but you may want to frame it and couch it and downplay it a little bit with words like rather, which will perhaps minimize how it comes across. Self-deprecation is something that the UK does extremely well, and so just be aware that that level of humility is alive and well in the culture and widely practiced. Okay, so that was a quick tour of the first part about what drives the US and UK consumers and clients that you're encountering. The next part now is a little look at some brands that you may want to emulate for what they're doing well. So I just thought I'd choose, in the interest of time, 4 that are interesting. JetBlue is the low-cost carrier in the US that flies point to point. And one of the things it's been doing during COVID, which is particularly interesting, is not only fully refunding its travelers because they've had to cancel their trips because of coronavirus, but they have also been highly communicative. They've been making suggestions for other ways that you can route your journey that may not involve them. The CEO has been doing lots of videos to customers and awarding extra mileage points to the loyalty program for those that are choosing to rebook within the next 12 to 18 months. And they have extended the number of months that you can use your qualified points, rather than them expiring on the dates that they would have expired before the middle of, we got word the middle of March. Now they have extended that by 18 to 24 months in many cases, with the goal ultimately of building loyalty amongst its fan base and hopefully being able to stay the course. Because as all of you, I'm sure, are aware, the aviation sector has been extremely hard hit, as has hospitality, by COVID-19. Pret a Manger, many of you may know that brand. They're on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a coffee sandwich restaurant chain, store chain. Most people buy their food at lunchtime and take it out, don't dine in. But they're offering, and have in the UK anyway, been giving free coffees to NHS National Health Service staff. And all you would need to do is show your badge and you get a coffee on the house as often as you like, which is really intelligent and very generous. And of course, everyone who knows this now thinks that this is a brand that's caring and sharing and is in it for the long haul rather than just trying to make a quick bit of money. Brewdog in the bottom right, as many of you will know, is a microbrewery that has turned its hand now to hand sanitizer gels and is giving many of those away for free to key workers, so teachers, nurses, medics, ambulance drivers, all sorts of people, public transportation, bus drivers and operators of the London Underground, for example, in an effort to demonstrate its interest in the well-being of companies. Now, many might say, oh, this is just a PR stunt. They're not really that interested, but actually it's got everybody talking about what BrewDog's doing. And of course, that's their goal. And the fact that BrewDog will go back to brewing beer, but in the meantime is using its assets to create an alcohol gel seems a very smart move. And finally, in the bottom left is Cambridge University Press, who are offering all of its school textbooks available online for free, at least during the COVID-19 crisis. Wouldn't surprise me if that continues well after. And the challenge, therefore, for all of these companies is the policies that they've put in place now since mid-March, will those be permanent, or will those be rolled back once we're back to a post-vaccine and a post-COVID world? I suspect it's going to be very hard to go back because it looks greedy, but maybe these companies will take some lessons from other marketers who are, interested in the loyalty building and using this time to do that, to communicate with their customers and clients on both sides of the Atlantic in order to be there when times come back. And of course, better times will come back. So, finally, de-risking your influencing communication and negotiation strategies across the Atlantic. So this is the point at which I launch into the cross-cultural part of the lecture. And there's a very interesting model for describing business cultures from a company called TMA, and their model is called Country Navigator. What you can see here are 9 dimensions of their model. There's 3 in the category of relating, 3 in the regulating, and 3 in the reasoning category. And what this basically does is gives 18 labels to the cultural differences that you might have noticed when you're negotiating across the Atlantic. And they give country profiles based on the database and the number of people that have answered the questionnaire. It takes about 10-15 minutes online. It costs about $20, £15 roughly. And it's worth doing because you can compare your profile, your preferred ways of working, with any of 99 other countries in their database. So that's quite handy if you're in the US and you want to see how you compare to the UK preferred ways of working. You can do that, and vice versa. So very briefly, I'll describe these because I'm then on the next slide going to show you the preferences of the US and the UK and Germany, where I suspect many of you are also negotiating and influencing and communicating, but it just gives a bit more context to it. So task and relationship is pretty straightforward. So imagining you're the blue dot on this grid and the green dot is any other country. What you would see in the diagnostic would be, where you lie on these 9. But the other thing, before I go into the detail of each of the 9 briefly, is there's no right answer. There are 90 points on this game board. There's 10-point scales times 9 dimensions. So you've got 90 areas where you could put a dot. And you might even think that it's your life's work to master all 90 positions, which is certainly mine. And the more you can stretch and try to be like another business culture, the better more capable and the better off you are in being able to engage and influence and communicate with counterparts in other parts of the world. Anyway, having said all that, task and relationship is probably pretty straightforward. Some business cultures prefer the getting stuff done, the task, and some prefer to first build the relationship before you negotiate and work on a task. The next one is about communicating, explicit and implicit, which we covered in a few minutes ago. The next one is about where credit is assigned. So some business cultures prefer that each member of a team gets the credit they deserve and that there's a shout out for what they do. And in other business cultures, it's not about the individual. Shout outs are actually pretty humiliating and embarrassing because you're pulling people away from the group. Instead, the whole group ought to be recognized for the group's achievements, not each individual member of the group. So then in the regulating cluster, you've got risk-taking or not. You have tight and loose control of time. So some business cultures have a tight control of time. It's really important that meetings start and end on time. And you often find there's a kind of correlation between the task relationship end of descriptor and the tight loose time. And generally task and time are highly correlated. So if you prefer task, getting the job done before getting to know the people, you also are likely to be from a business culture that's also looking at the clock. Shared and concentrated, the next one is about power and decision making. Shared meaning it's very democratic. Everybody's vote is equal regardless of your role and seniority and status in the organization. Whereas concentrated means the decisions are made by one or a very few number of people. Now the final cluster, linear circular, is about reasoning. Linear meaning you present data along a time frame. You present your case, you build a case based on time. So first this happened, then third this happened. So it's sequential. Whereas circular is you present information in not a linear way, in maybe a more random way. Oh, this happened. Oh, that's true. And then I remember this also happened. Yes. So that can be, it's hard probably to navigate for the linears to be comfortable in a circular business culture. Facts and thinking is about data versus theory. So facts are those business cultures that want to first hear the data and conclude a theory based on the data. Other business cultures prefer to start with the theory and then find that the data fits in with theory. So some want a framework first, some want the data first. Last but not least is about context and the amount of context. So simple is the foreground and complex means the background. Now, there's no absolutes. None of you are extreme on one or the other, which means that you only can do task, for example, and you can't relate to other people. That's not what this is saying. However, what this is suggesting is you may want to balance it a bit more when you're with a business culture that's not like your own. So trying something new, trying to emulate the other business culture that may be very different to yours. So the US, UK, as you'll see in a moment, would be a really good thing to do. So here's the UK profile. And this is based on several thousand respondents in the TMA Country Navigator database who have identified themselves as British in business people. What does this tell you? Well, it tells you that the UK is definitely about implied communication. It's definitely, let's look at complex, so it wants context. And then there's this interesting visual from a great observer of cross-cultural working also called Richard Lewis. And there's a kind of graphic that gives you an idea here of what does it look like when you're communicating with people from the UK from start to finish. So imagine you're in a meeting. This might be the shape of the meeting and the processes that are at play during that meeting. Next, you have the US, and you can see that the US is all of those dots are near the left-hand pole. So that gives you an idea of how you might influence, communicate with them. And then here's the visual of what an American meeting might well look like from start to end, with the outcome being clarity. Not necessarily agreement, at least clarity. And then briefly, just to add some context, is Germany. So you can see it's a little American and it's a little British too. So it's definitely concentrated in the decision-making area. So decisions made by a few. It definitely is high on context. It wants the backstory as well. But, you know, some of the left-hand dots are where the US is. Some of the dots in the middle is where the UK is. It's maybe just helps you make sense of all three cultures. And then again, visually, this might be what a German meeting looks like, where that process is pretty linear and pretty constant in terms of the time and the degree of divergence or convergence. It's pretty consistent throughout. So, one of the key ways to retain and grow your custom across the Atlantic is by being trusted. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's a theory posited by David Maister, and he suggests that, you know, if your company or you as a leader want to be trusted, then you need to keep your eye on four characteristics. One is be credible. One is being reliable. Another is fostering intimacy, and yet another is your self-interest. And of course, the higher your self-interest appears to be, the less trustworthy you are relative to the three factors in the numerator. Why do we care about this? Because credibility looks different on both sides of the Atlantic. So I would be credible in the United States if I had a very polished, fault-free webinar today, no slide hiccups, no tech hiccups, smooth handovers back to Lauren. That would make me highly credible. Whereas in the UK, you're more credible if you're more human, you're more realistic, you do have an error arise, you are fallible, it isn't overly polished or overly rehearsed. So I mention that because paying attention to some of these factors that are dictated by the business culture will determine how trustworthy or not you're perceived to be. So one thought based on what we've covered so far on this last section is you may want to use that 9-dimension grid and plot where you are and plot where a key transatlantic stakeholder for you lies. And this should be somebody with whom you'd like a happier or easier, less stressful working relationship. And then have a guess at where you think that person is, and maybe think about what you can do to bridge the gaps. How might you become more relationship oriented, or how might you become more implicit? Or how might you be more tight in terms of controlling time? So I've provided on the next slide for you a picture of the grid. So by all means, feel free to use this. You may even want to use it inside the business after today with more people than just yourself, but with colleagues too. So really in conclusion, before we go to the questions, there's a couple of things you may want to look at after today. There's the more of the diagrams from Richard Lewis in this Business Insider article. There's a very interesting piece from Think with Google on crisis marketing, specifically about companies that are doing innovative things in the face of COVID-19. And then, of course, there's some really good books. Erin Mayer's written The Culture Map, a very good, useful book on generally across cultures. Of course, there's our Working with Americans book that Mandy referenced at the start today. There's John Sopel's book, If Only They Didn't Speak English, about his time in Washington as the BBC's correspondent in the US. And finally, a book about teams and trust. And ways that if you're working in a transatlantic team or you're working in partnership with a customer or a client on a transatlantic team, there's some great pieces of advice in Patrick Lencioni's book on teams and high-functioning teams that you may find useful also. So with that, I'm delighted to move on to your questions in the time remaining. Let me look in the chat section here and see what questions we have. But by all means, please post your questions now. Great. So I see an excellent question here. The question is, of all the excellent advice, which is the one key point that you feel we must not forget when trading with the US? Well, gosh, I'd probably say the John Sokol expression of if only they didn't speak English. The assumptions that we make about each other, that we're more alike than different, often means we're also assuming that they do business in the US or in the UK just like we do here at home. And I think checking those assumptions and assuming maybe that the US or the UK is profoundly different to how it works in your home market is absolutely essential. If you treated it like you approach China or South American markets or Middle East, you probably would be wise to assume that the differences are significant. And as you saw in that earlier grid, they are significant. So don't let the language similarity lull you into thinking that we're very close culturally, because we are very not close culturally. So that's great. Thank you for your question. Let's see. Let me go to David Green. Idea for further study, comparison between inter-regions, California versus New York, London versus Birmingham. Absolutely true. So we've been flying at sort of 30,000 feet today. And you're right. I wish we could. Maybe we'll do another webinar looking at the sort of the regional differences, because while there are huge differences, between the countries at that 30,000 foot level, there's also major differences, as you rightly point out, between cities within the same country. There are lots of microclimates, and often the differences are driven by pace. By the speed of transacting, by the industries that dominate in those regions. So that's a really good point to raise, and I hope we get the chance to do another one of these webinars looking at the regional differences too. So thank you for raising that. Let's see, Jeremy Taylor. What are my thoughts on building a relationship with US individuals through LinkedIn? Absolutely great. So LinkedIn is the ultimate American invention. It's extrovert like American business culture is. It rewards extrovert behavior. Americans generally are pretty open to approaches, and LinkedIn is a really good vehicle for that. So I think that would be a really smart thing to do. Twitter, yes. But I think LinkedIn, everyone who's on LinkedIn pretty much recognizes that LinkedIn is a business tool. So you should unapologetically use that to keep in touch with current customers, clients, associates, but also potentially prospecting. Be careful with the prospecting, though, in terms of how you do it. I think it needs to feel that there's a personal connection, that you have some people in common is the best way to use LinkedIn to identify who the common contacts are between you and the person you're wanting to get in touch with in the States. Okay, Eileen, thank you for your compliment. That's nice. Peter Coleman, can you comment on brinkmanship when used in US-UK negotiations, please? Yes. So I think brinkmanship comes across as bullishness, provided it's backed up with data and a track record. So we like bullishness in the United States, but we need to also know that the promise that you might be making about how amazing your product and service is can be backed up. And if we do our due diligence, that we're going to find that what you've said is true. So we like confidence a lot. We like people that are believers. So brinkmanship works, as I say, provided you can back it up with facts. Let's see. There's another comment here. I work in Texas. Jeremy Taylor, thank you. I work in Texas, and there's a big difference between Austin and Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. Absolutely right. That's to our earlier point about the the regional differences. Here's one from Herb and March Williams. Thank you for your question. What areas are no-go on either side of the Atlantic in terms of humor? Okay, so for the U.S., I would steer clear of politics. It's a heated topic right now. The likelihood is high that you will offend someone. And even though you might be convinced that everybody shares your point of view about the American political landscape as it is today, it's likely not everyone really does. So I'd steer clear of politics. I'd steer clear of LGBTQ or sex and jokes about that. I would steer clear of, well, let's talk about what you can talk about. So what works on both sides of the Atlantic is sports, entertainment, Netflix, especially now in our COVID-19 world, where probably everyone on this call has been binge watching box sets more than they have in their entire lives. So topics like that are things that you can discuss. Obviously, COVID-19 has meant that many people have had to change their work habits, commuting patterns, family commitments. So I think I'd focus on the things you can talk about. And there's more that you can than what you can't. Okay, let's see. Okay, Kiki Stanard asks, what are the differences in business relationship protocol in New York versus California? So I would say that New York's a bit faster paced in terms of transacting and a bit more impatient, perhaps. So it's much more task oriented, or it feels that way. California, by all means, is also successful as an economy, but the New York urgency, get it done, do it now, is palpable. And I think that's what most people observe about the differences between those two geographies. Let's see, any other questions? How are we doing for time? So we're just about out of time. I see one more question, Jeremy, thank you for yours. How prevalent is made in USA in respect of buying decisions? Do you think we have an edge being British? Absolutely, you have an edge being British. So yes, while made in the USA for Americans is something we're very proud of, the UK has a fantastic reputation for innovation and quality. So putting the British flag on your products, on your website, and selling the story of your Britishness is a good thing to do. But selling the story about how the past, your heritage, your innovations have informed why you're so great today is probably the best way to do it, especially if you're a heritage brand that's been around for 100 or several hundred years. But the U.S. is very impressed with anything where innovation is at its core. I mean, look at the fact that Oxford University and AstraZeneca now look to be in the forefront of vaccine development. And so obviously the US right now thinks that this country, in the UK where I am sitting now, is something that's at the forefront, modern, and innovative. So I would heartily recommend doing so and promoting your UK heritage. Well, I'm sorry we've run short of time today, but any questions that you might have after this session, by all means, please get in touch with me. You've got my details here. My LinkedIn profile is here. My Vimeo videos, Twitter, my email and phone. Don't hesitate to make contact. And I'm really delighted that you chose to spend your morning or afternoon with me this afternoon, and especially grateful to the Greater Birmingham Transatlantic Chamber of Commerce for putting this on today for everybody. So thank you all so much for joining me today.